Richard, maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself to start. You've had a long and successful career in music. How did that feed into your interest in this subject and your ability to put all this incredible information together?
I think that probably the two things, although they're not mutually exclusive, they are kind of separate as well. I have had a long, I don't know about successful, but I have had a long career in the music industry, and that, like so many things in my life, was accidental. I trained as a graphic designer, and I had every intention of being a graphic designer. And I graduated into a recession where no one was taking on graphic designers. And I just accidentally found an advert for a job at a record company. And I thought, I've got some records. It's like, I could do that, surely. And I had several interviews. I was lucky enough to get several interviews for that job, and I didn't get the job. But because I didn't get the job and I decided I wanted it, I'd sort of refocused my attentions, and I just badgered that particular record company, London Records, they're called, until they allowed me to work for them for free, which was very kind of them, obviously. And that was the start of my music career. And I have worked for record labels and for MTV Europe, and now I work for myself, with a sort of a suite of artists that I work with. So that is one thing, and I suppose the sort of the point at which those two stories start is I had a lot of records. I've always been a fan of music, but contrary to what people expect of me, having written listening to the music the machines make about electronic pop, my music taste is actually very broad. It's a wide church, and although obviously I love the electronic pop music, I kind of like everything else as well. So I've sort of dipped in and out professionally and personally to all sorts of different genres. And it's like on any given day, I could be listening to something, diametrically opposite to the thing that I was listening to the day before, which is a sort of a roundabout way of answering your question and bringing those two things together. So I suppose the book was inspired by the fact that, as I mentioned, I am a fan of electronic pop. I love reading books about music. I read all the sort of the biographies that come out, and everything that comes through. And so I've sort of read the biographies of some of the players within this scene, and I realised that sometimes the accounts don't always quite marry up. Because I think that when you're looking back on something over 45 years, which is the sort of the scale of time that has elapsed since these events, I think everything becomes a little bit hazy. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was one book which went back to the original source materials and layered all these stories on top of each other, so that everything was sort of in a convenient timeline, so we could sort of see how it opens up and see who actually influenced who, and how this sort of whole new genre of music kind of was created, and that was the starting point. And then I just sort of sat on the idea for ages and ages and ages, and I went to the British Library, which is a huge resource in London here in England, and I spent just a couple of hours. This is a good few years ago now. I just spent just a couple of hours in their music section, which is fantastic. If you ever get the opportunity to go, it's brilliant. You can just walk up to a shelf and just pull down these massive leather-bound volumes. They're sort of this thick, and they'll contain 6 months of the NME from whatever year you choose. It's just amazing. And I chose 1978, and I got this big sort of ledger of issues down. And I just started turning the pages and going through and looking for the references to the things that I was interested in. And every time I found one, I'd take a photo of it on my mobile phone. And I did this, just for sort of half of 1978. And I took all these photos away and sort of, typed up some of the bits and pieces that were of interest. And that gradually became the book.
And this is important, right? That you have really produced a definitive timeline of this period in this genre because of your reliance on these
Yeah.
archival materials.
Yeah, it wasn't quite intentional. I wasn't really setting out to do anything definitive. And initially, actually, I wasn't really setting out to use the original materials either. I thought they would be the supporting cast, as it were. And through my work, I have access to quite a few of the protagonists in the story. And I thought that I would just interview them and talk to them about new things. And then I started, like I was just saying about the biographies, I started to realize that those accounts aren't necessarily always the most reliable. And sometimes people sort of put a different spin on things, or they've been told over the years that a different spin has been put on those things, and it sort of taints the way you look at everything. So it was quite early on that I dropped that idea and went to the idea of just using source materials.
Mm.
But it wasn't really supposed to be a definitive anything. In fact, I had a book launch a couple of weeks ago, and I was very lucky to have Martin Ware from the Human League and Heaven 17 and British Electric Foundation as one of my guests. And we were talking before we sort of did our on-stage interview, and I gave him a copy of the book, and he immediately opened it up and looked for Martin Ware in the index. And then he said, "This seems like it's the definitive work." And
Mm.
I'm, well, it's like possibly it's definitive in that, strangely, no one has really written about this scene before. And he said, well, it's like, if even more so, if there's no other books on the subject and this is the one, then it's definitely the definitive work on the subject. So from that point of view, I'll go with it.
Yes, yes, let's do. Um, Talk about the significance of the years 1978 to 1983. For those who didn't experience this in real time, why do those years matter?
1978 to 1983 is the scope of the book. So basically, I sort of deep dive into everything electronic pop that was going on in those years. And it was easier to find the end point, which is 1983, because the last record that I was absolutely desperate to write about and make sure was included was New Order's Blue Monday. And New Order's Blue Monday was released several times and charted several times and had a sort of a strange career all of its own. But in 1983, it was a cornerstone. But it seemed to me that New Order's Blue Monday was more than just its moment. It was also a signpost to so many of the things that were coming after it. New Order were very quick to sort of get involved in that Arthur Baker, New York electro scene. So that sort of sound had sort of fed back into their music, and they'd sort of dealt it up in their own interpretation. And I felt that was very influential and very interesting. And it also put me in a position where I could basically leave what happens next to other books, because at that point electronic music was so ubiquitous, that it was difficult to start pulling out what was an electronic act and what wasn't. It was just like everything kind of was, and that sort of blurring of the boundaries made it quite difficult. And that whole electronic pop area, it started to fragment, and it's like went in different directions and subgenres, and then those genres had subgenres, and the whole thing got very, very complicated. So sort of the finishing point was quite easy. And then moving the other way to where I started, which is 1978, it was going to be 1977 or 1978. And again, it was to do with the records that were being released. So it was either going to be I Feel Love by Donna Summer, or it was going to be the sort of immediate post-punk experimentation of people like The Normal and the Human League. And in the end, I decided that disco, although it was influential, and I Feel Love was an epic record with huge impact on this scene, it felt like the story really started when a new generation started to sort of play with the machines and make their own music. And so in my head, it was going to be Being Boiled by the Human League. And then Daniel Miller pointed out that his record, The Normal, TBOD, was actually before that. So that was kind of the point at which I started looking at 1978.
And that's interesting to me because by not going with 77 and the Giorgio Moroder disco oriented track, you really were embracing the post-punk kind of ethic, kind of aesthetic that fed into a lot of that early stage electronic pop music. So this was very much, again, within the scope of your book, very much an experimental music period.
It was incredibly interesting. And I'm 55 now. So in 1978, I would have been 10, 10 or 11. So I was kind of unaware of any of this, to be honest. It's like, being boiled and the normal. I found them retrospectively. I wasn't that cool 10-year-old who was in the loop with everything that was going on. But looking back on it kind of was amazing. It's like I think punk was the enabler. But I think what was interesting about the generation of artists that I write about is that they kind of had no boundaries. There was no sort of snobbishness about the influences that they brought into their music. So they would sort of talk quite freely about, progressive rock or disco or soul music or krautrock or, whatever it was that caught their attention and caught their ear. And all these things sort of just came into this sort of big, interesting, fascinating melting pot at the same time that the synthesizer had become something that was affordable, something that was in the reach of, a band who would previously have automatically picked up a guitar. People were starting to be able to pick up a synthesizer. They couldn't really use them, but they could sort of make noises. And I think those noises are kind of the most interesting part of the story in a way, because they are the sort of culmination of naivety and this sort of, vast spectrum of influence. And they fed into this moment, which created kind of a whole new music industry.
This wasn't new technology. In fact, a lot of, what we would call classic rock acts were using this technology. But it was just out of reach of a lot of young people. In that sense, it was very much in keeping with the punk aesthetic of not only being able to access the technology, but not being bothered about proficiency.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fantastic and also absolutely key. Because what I found also interesting was that going back in the accounts of these people starting out their music, was punk was incredibly influential, but not musically. It was more to do with attitude and infrastructure and the whole idea of being able to do it yourself. Sort of taking that power away from the music industry, I think was a very important sort of part of this story. So the fact that, you could get this synthesizer and put it in your bedroom and you could record it onto a cassette, and therefore you have an artifact that you can sell or pass on, completely sidestep the music industry, as it was before. And the possibilities from that point on were kind of endless. It was incredibly important. And I suspect that we'll never see anything quite like it again.
Besides the years that you chose, there is also the focus specifically on electronic pop music. Did you ever consider just doing a book about the new wave music scene or the early alternative music scene? Why specifically electronic for you?
I think it was because a combination of things, really. It's like in 2009, I started working with Erasure. And they I still work with them today, and they have sort of become a very big part of my working and friendship life, which is fantastic. And I think doing that sort of nudged me back into rediscovering the electronic side of the music that I was interested in, and there's a lot of music writing around, and lots of it by very stellar music writers, and I don't count myself as that at all. I count myself entirely as a fan of music, and as an enthusiast. But there just didn't seem to be very much written about this particular movement, and I thought that was really strange. And the genesis of the book is probably maybe up to 10 years since I sort of had the initial sort of glimmers of ideas. And for that whole 10 years, I thought, I'm not going to get away with this. Someone's just going to write that book before me. It's going to come out, and all my efforts will be in vain. And fortunately, that didn't happen. Although a couple of books did come out that sort of skimmed the edges, but it just felt that there was an opportunity there to go somewhere that no one had particularly gone into in this sort of detail.
Mm-hmm. Every generation loves the music that it grows up with. You and I are about the same age, so we grew up with the same music.
Mm.
Here in Canada, there were a lot of us were Anglophiles, either by virtue of the families we grew up in, or just simply because we love the music. But one of the great surprises to me growing up is how many younger people have embraced this period of music. I remember in my last year of high school, 1985, when really, as you've correctly identified here, this period had come to a close. We were into something very different. And yet I was struck by how many of my the younger students were still interested in the same music that we were. And of course, that carried on. The music maintained its a kind of relevancy. But why? What is it about this period that resonates so much?
I actually don't know, to be perfectly honest. I think that perhaps it's because the sounds were so new and so startling and so of their moment that they were embraced by the generation to which they were released in a way that elevated them high enough that they could still be high as that generation sort of rolled through. And I think that because at the basis of the music that I write about, most of the music that I write about in the book is pop music, and that was quite an important distinction. And I think that this generation and this technology lent themselves so beautifully to pop music, and I think pop music is something that, if it's done well, it's kind of timeless. And I think that this generation of artists did it very, very well. And they sort of set a new template, which you can still sort of see today, and it sort of, it ebbs and it flows. But it seems that there's a movement towards, in electronic music today, towards a more simple approach, which echoes, I think, more the ineptitude, perhaps, of those original pioneers. And everything has become a little bit more stripped back and a little bit more pure. And I think it'll probably just sort of loop and loop and loop, in and out of that, for time immemorial. But I don't have a proper answer for you, but that's a couple of suggestions.
Well, it was a pop music made also at a difficult time, politically and economically, and there was such a contrast between the very glossy, dance-oriented, not always happy. There was a great deal of emotional depth to a lot of this music, but it certainly didn't sound like the environment in which it was coming out of. It sounded to me like a reaction to that environment, a kind of escapism. And maybe that still resonates.
Yeah, I think that's probably very true. I think there's an authenticity to it, isn't there? It's like it feels like it comes from the right place and it is presented in the right way. And perhaps that's something that has been lost since. I'm not saying entirely, it's not like there hasn't been great music, ever since 1983. But I think the concentration of music that would be considered classic now within that period is almost certainly weighted in that period's favour. I haven't studied that specifically. That's just a theory.
Perhaps volume two. I want to focus specifically on electronic music, both in and outside of the pop music world. You make the point that after Blue Monday, there was a kind of move into the electro thing out of New York. And it does seem to me that you can draw a pretty straight line through the evolution of electronic music from this period that you've written about. Are you impressed by modern day electronic music? Do you listen to it very much? What do you hear there that sparks your interest?
I am impressed by modern day electronic music. I remain a fan of music. I find the finding of new music more tricky than the enjoying of music. And that is curious to me because it sort of feels like we're in an environment now where finding new music should be really, really easy, because everything is curated and presented. And, I'm sure that my Spotify listening habits, should lead me to new things. But I find that doesn't really happen. And it's almost always someone will tell me something that I should listen to, and I'll have a listen to that, and that will become something of interest. There's a band called Nation of Language, who are a New York band, I think, and I'd not really heard of them. I think they're on their second album now. And someone said, "Oh, you should listen to Nation of Language," and I listened to it. I thought, this is a really good record.
Mm.
But it's in comparison to the records that I've grown up with, they don't quite cut it for me. But I don't think that's the music's fault. I think that's my fault. And I think that's to do with the way you are when you're younger. As a consumer of music, you put so much more of yourself into music when you're 14. It's so much more important. And now it feels like it's a soundtrack to my life, whereas then it was my life.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like I've invested so much of myself in those earlier records that nothing that I listen to now will really quite catch up.
Mm. The thing that strikes me about a lot of modern electronic music is that you can see a great deal of respect for the early artists. And I'm thinking specifically about a group like Kraftwerk, which clearly played a foundational role in the period that you've written about. But it's almost as though the music has returned back to that kind of hyper electronic approach, less pop music oriented. It's like it began as an experimentation, it went through this pop music phase, and now it's gone back to what, you call it club culture, whatever, but it is deeply experimental, in my opinion. I'm curious about your thoughts on the significance of Kraftwerk now, half a century later, still just such an extraordinary
Yeah,
impression they made on us.
it is absolutely, like you say. I think extraordinary is the right word. It's like a band with a relatively small catalogue behind them,
Mm.
to have been as revolutionary as they were, and to not only have been revolutionary in their own world, but to have crossed over into other worlds. It's like you sort of hear about the Kraftwerk interviews, when they were absolutely baffled by the fact that black kids in Brooklyn in America, were dancing to numbers, and you can kind of see why.
Mm.
It's not the sort of thing you could ever predict, but it's like I think they were their attention to detail, and I think also because they were in quite a privileged position financially, and socially, they were able to invest in their art. So they were able to have machinery, synthesizers and things built for them, to their specification. And I think because they had that luxury, they could be much more specific about the music that their output was. And therefore the sort of the quality perhaps was higher as a result.
Mm.
The fact that they didn't seem to rush it, they did seem to sort of consider it, and put these things out. But yeah, they are an amazing band and will always be one of my favorites.
And they've continued to evolve. Like, if you listen to that most recent live album that they produced, very modern sounding,
Yeah,
very, very up to date.
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I've read the Karl Bartos book, and I've read the Wolfgang Flür book, and I've read a couple of the other Kraftwerk biographies. But it always seems very incongruous to think of Kraftwerk in the discos, on the dance floor, listening to the latest music. But that seems to be a thread which is always there and is very important. They were fans of music. and they were consumers of music, and they were sort of taking all this stuff on board. Yes, so yeah, an important act indeed.
Richard, thank you for this very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
An absolute pleasure to talk to you too.
Thanks.